Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about George Takei's graphic novel, They Called Us Enemy. So basically, this novel is about the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, including George Takei and his family. Now, I did a video not super long ago about Art Spiegelman's graphic novel Maus, which was about Spiegelman interviewing his father about his experiences during the Holocaust. It's unsettlingly striking how similar They Called Us Enemy is to Maus. Now, the ending actually does really diverge from what we get in Maus. We have a very different ending that Takei gives us, and it's absolutely important to note that the internment camps for Japanese Americans never became death camps in a way that the Nazi concentration camps did, or some of the Nazi concentration camps did at least. So that's very much a distinction that's worth making. That being said, the early phases of this graphic novel have a lot of scenes that are very, very similar to what we get in Maus. The initial announcements, for instance, of the outbreak of war, the popular discrimination as well as the enshrined legal discrimination against Japanese Americans. We get a number of politicians, images of politicians, etc., etc., making these very sweeping anti-Japanese statements, very racist statements. Fletcher Bowron, for instance, mayor of Los Angeles, this is what it says here, testified before Congress that we were non-assimilable. And the quotes from him are, "They are Japanese and nothing else. Regardless of how many generations may have been born in America, undoubtedly many of them intend to be loyal, but when the final test comes, who can say but that blood will tell? We cannot run the risk of another Pearl Harbor episode." This is the same kind of thing that we see in Maus, the same kind of thing that we saw with the Holocaust. The establishment of a rhetoric that others a particular ethnic group by identifying them as internal enemy aliens, a population to be controlled and forcibly removed. And indeed, we have a pretty lengthy section in the early portion of the book where the Takei family is being transported on trains. We have very, very similar episodes in Maus where the Spiegelmans are being transported on trains because, again, this was a very efficient way in the 1930s and 40s of moving people under guard to a centralized location. We have a lot of time where they're in the camps and there is substantial disagreement among the Japanese internee population about the proper response to this. Should they try and prove that they are in fact loyal American citizens? Should they declare their allegiance to the Empire of Japan because the US has turned on them and betrayed their trust, etc., etc.? Should they try and volunteer for the US Army when that option becomes available? And it does, and a lot of Japanese Americans served extraordinarily bravely in World War II. So there's all of these different distinctions. And there's different camps. The Takei family actually, because of their answers to a loyalty survey, get moved to a more restrictive camp partway through the novel. So we have all of these different elements. But along with that, actually, one of the other similarities to Maus is that even in the camps, there are these moments of happiness or these moments of sort of communal feeling. So in one instance, the children in one of the camps are visited by a Santa Claus, and actually, it's kind of an interesting episode because George, young George, says that he realized this was not the real Santa because he had gone to sit on the real Santa's lap in a mall or something. And that Santa was white. This Santa is Japanese. But he didn't ruin this Santa's appearance for his younger brother and sister. So again, we've got these moments of collective activity, these moments of trying to make joy in this horrendous and unfair situation. But we've also got these moments of extraordinary humiliation, degradation, and injustice. At one point, the U.S. government offered internees in the camps the choice to renounce their citizenship, their U.S. citizenship, and be deported to Japan in exchange for U.S. prisoners of war. The problem is this was a coerced choice. Because one of the things that the graphic novel emphasizes is that the guards made explicitly clear that outside the barbed wire of the camp, Japanese Americans were not trusted. They were hated, they were feared by the larger white, primarily American population. And so the idea was that if you renounce your citizenship, you get to stay in the camps where you will be protected from general racist violence against Japanese people. Whereas if you don't renounce your citizenship and you instead sign a loyalty oath to the United States, you'll be released, but then you will have to deal with violence from the American population more broadly. And so the Takei family, their parents, George's father and mother, renounced their citizenship in order to remain in the camps to try and protect their family, their 3 young children, in addition to themselves. And this actually created massive, massive problems because after the war was over, there were continued attempts to deport Japanese Americans who had renounced their citizenship in an attempt to keep their families safe. And that involved long legal battles. And finally, after years of legal battles, George's mother was able to regain her citizenship, for instance. So, again, we've got all of these very, very uncomfortable echoes of Spiegelman's Maus. The idea of being identified as an enemy alien, the idea of being transported on trains to a communal holding area, the idea of being faced constantly with the threat of violence, the idea of living in squalid housing without adequate sanitation, without adequate food, all these things. All of this is extraordinarily uncomfortable because, in theory, the U.S. was fighting against the Nazis. We were fighting against the people perpetrating the Holocaust, and yet in the U.S., the same kinds of tactics were being used against Japanese Americans. Now, one of the things that's really, really interesting about They Called Us Enemy is actually that despite everything that's happened, George's father maintained faith in American democracy and actually instilled in George a love of activism and political engagement. And that's a thing that we get really in the last third or so of the novel, particularly, is George's engagement with political campaigns, civil rights activity, not just for African Americans, but also pro-Japanese or Japanese American civil rights activity and LGBT civil rights activity. So we get all of this stuff. We also, of course, get a discussion of Star Trek and the casting for Star Trek and the importance of that role for not just Japanese Americans, of the role of Hikaru Sulu, who George Takei played for all 3 seasons of the show, not just for Japanese Americans, but for Asian Americans more generally. And so there is actually a really positive element toward the end of the graphic novel. There's this notion of like redemption and things getting better. But this is also balance, and actually the election of Obama is brought up here. We get Obama discussed as part of this whole things are getting better potentially idea. But at the same time, there is a worrying element at the end of the graphic novel because right below the picture of Obama, this symbol of perhaps increasing racial equity, that's very debatable, but perhaps, we have a picture of immigrants, asylum seekers being detained illegally in violation of both U.S. and international law by the Trump administration in June of 2018. We get the Supreme Court overruling the decision, which was Fred Korematsu, who had brought his case to the Supreme Court in 1944 to protest his illegal detention as part of the detention of Japanese Americans. The Korematsu decision was upheld until 2018, when the Supreme Court was like, yeah, we fucked it up. That was the wrong decision. And that's a good thing. That's a ruling that should have been overturned. But what Takei also points out is that in that same ruling, Trump versus Hawaii, while it overruled Korematsu, it also established that the Trump administration, the U.S. government, could bar Muslims specifically from entering the U.S. That's not exactly what they said necessarily, but essentially that was the upshot of it. So while there is this optimism about American democracy and about progress and about the moves toward justice and equity, it's also tempered by these very serious concerns about the ways in which the United States continues to fall short of the ideals of justice, equality, full access for everyone, etc., etc.